Good morning once more, dear friends, and welcome to the main object meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, the main object big book study, I should say. I am an alcoholic. My name is David. So, good to see you all. And I've asked my dear friend Kathy Mack to read the AA preamble, which I'm going to bring up on the screen. So, Kathy,
Mhm.
when you see it.
Morning, everybody. I'm Kathy. I'm an alcoholic. This is AA's preamble. Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of people who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other that they may solve their common problem and help others to recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. There are no dues or fees for AA membership. We are self supporting through our own contributions. AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution, does not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. Thanks, guys.
Kathy, thank you so much for your service. And now I'm going to ask everyone to join me in inviting God into our meeting this morning by reciting the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Like to welcome everybody. I don't think there's any new folks here, but just as a reminder, we are a line by line big book study. We categorize the text into five specific categories. The purpose of doing that and of spending this time and of going through the book very slowly is to really uh, awaken our relationship with the big book so that we are able to use it as, I think, a powerful tool in order to carry the message and understand the key principles that our founders intended to convey through the book. And one of the things that I sometimes find is I've had a tendency to apply logic and worldly teachings to the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. The only problem with that is that a large part of our program and a large part of the meaning and the actions that the founders intended run counter to logic and worldly teachings. So, what I find is that by diving into the book and looking very closely at what our founders intended, we reignite that, I would say, that counterintuitive or non intuitive nature of our program and reignite the original spirit of what our founders wanted to convey to other alcoholics and really to the world. Um, so thank you all for being here with me with this through this journey. Um, and we talk about. I think everybody's seen the five categories, so I'm not going to um, go into that right now. I will.
Oh, actually, David, I haven't seen the five categories.
Well, there we go. Thank you, Stephen, and I appreciate that. So let's. I'm glad you spoke up. Then here we go. All right, there they are. Questions in directions and explanations, promises, warnings, and history. And what you will see is the colors next to them correspond to, for me, the highlighter colors that I use. And I do that for two reasons. One is that I have this very alarming addiction to office products. So that allows me to use my my highlighter basket, and gives me a reason to go to Staples. So, but I can stop anytime I want. I just, don't want to. And, but seriously, the second reason is by color coding the text in this way, it not only emphasizes the particular points that are trying to be made in the text, but what it really does for me is it makes it a quick and easy reference when, like, let's say I'm needing to locate a point for my own benefit, or I'm working with a sponsee and I want to say, okay, what are some promises that are connected with, like, the 10th step or the first step or whatever? Because especially promises, because, or rewards, because for a long time I believe there was just one. They said, okay, we're going to read the promises now, and then they would read the 10th step promises. But what I've since learned is that there are promises associated with every single step, and our founders didn't believe it the case that benefits come to us just when we get, as it says, before we're halfway through with the ninth step. There are benefits that come to us from the very first day with the first step if we are following it as it is laid out again, as intended by our founders. So anyway, I am going to, we'll see. There isn't a lot of text we will cover today. Usually we try to cover about 2 pages. This morning we're going to only cover one because we're coming to the close of the chapter. We'll see where we go from there. I have this fantasy I'm enjoying right now that tells me we'll finish early today, but we'll see. I will talk until about 7 with all this, 7 Eastern Time, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions and so forth. The meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel, which archives every meeting. So you can listen from the beginning. I think something like the first 8 or 9 weeks we didn't think to record. So next time we go through the book, we'll get that. But it's there, and the link. Oh, thank you so much there, Rich, for posting that stuff. You'll find the link in the chat. So with that, let's jump to, we're beginning today at the very bottom of page 42, at the very end of our chapter 3, what more about alcoholism. And just recall, if you weren't here last week, we've been visiting with our friend Fred the accountant, and recognizing certain parallels between Fred's story and Bill's story, and how there are certain elements that are parallel, but then Fred goes in one direction, the unfortunate direction. Bill ends up employing spiritual principles and ends up in a positive direction. Also, what we recognize as well with Fred's story is that there are parallels also with other stories we've heard so far, such as Jim the automobile salesman and the jaywalker. So what we've where we ended up last week was Fred is recognizing through this last bottom that he had, most recent bottom, and I think his last one, was that self-reliance was doing him in time and time again, and what he needed to do was fully, he needed to become one of Robbie's frogs. Robbie talks about the frog, and which means, there it is, thank you, my friend, fully relying upon God. And so at the bottom of page 42, these last two lines and all of the paragraph that follows onto the next page on 43, I have as a promise. And I have it as a promise because, as we're seeing, he talks about a spiritual way of living and adopting a spiritual way of living without reservation. And I think because of the level of surrender and how we are programmed from birth and in our society to be self-reliant and rely on the power of our minds, that the ability to surrender our life to a higher power is really coming through the grace of God. It's not something that we can just will or make a decision about intellectually. So, moving into this, quite as important was the discovery that spiritual principles would solve all my problems. I have since been brought into a way of living infinitely more satisfying and, I hope, more useful than the life I lived before. My old manner of life was by no means a bad one. I'm just going to pause here for a second. The thing that sets Fred apart from Jim, the automobile salesman, and Bill, and our fictional Jay Walker, is that unlike those three individuals, Fred had a relatively, I guess you would say, high bottom. Still had the wife, still had the business, still probably had 2 cars in the garage. But as we see, the underlying spiritual journey and the damage, well, maybe the damage of alcohol was a little bit different in Fred's case, but he's definitely a higher bottom than those other folks. So my old manner of life was by no means a bad one, but I would not exchange its best moments for the worst I have now. I would not go back to it even if I could. So that's all a promise or a reward. And so I have it highlighted in blue. Now I want to go back to something because it's a term in the beginning of this paragraph that I really didn't quite understand for a while, but just recently in working with some sponsees, some of these ideas have really come forward for me. And that is, back into the first sentence, quite as important was the discovery that spiritual principles would solve all my problems. Now, I'm going to venture out on a limb here and share, let's just call this is more an original insight than, I'm not saying and while it's just not directly from the literature, that's all I'm saying. So if it's useful, great. And if it's not, don't worry about it. Don't fret on it, because it's not. It's working for me, but it may not work for you. And what I'm talking about is the notion of a spiritual principle. What's a spiritual principle? And the reason that this is been coming up for me is somewhat apart from this meeting. In working with a couple of my sponsees, what we've been doing is focusing on the 12 and 12, working with the 12 and 12 and not the big book. And one of the things that I have found, and I think somebody that I was working with actually brought it up. It wasn't my brilliant idea. They actually asked, well, what's a principle? Because someone was asking, maybe one of their sponsees was asking them, well, what's a principle? Or they talk about the AA principles. And one of the things that, unlike, we have 12 steps, we have 12 traditions, we have the 12 concepts. There is not a fixed list of here are the 12 AA principles. It's a looser term than those other things. At the same time, when we look at the 12 and 12, and which complements, of course, the big book, one of the things that I have found and observed is that and this is just a loose generalization, don't take this as law, but in general, what I have found is that the big book, and the reason my book is read is I'm working with the study edition. In general, what I have found is that the big book conveys or shares with us actions. It shares with us, or I should say, I've looked at it, facts and actions. Meaning, here are the medical facts of the disease. Here are the actions that you take in order to be free of it. Absolutely critical, okay? What the 12 and 12 does, even though it has certain facts, absolutely, and it has certain actions, absolutely, its primary focus is on conveying principles rather than facts and actions. And so what do I mean when I say principles? And I think that this is important because I thought there are, and we'll get this posted, or it'll be in the meeting notes, which will be with the YouTube video. I think that there are three aspects of something we would call a principle. And the three aspects are, a principle is true, and I'll define that in a moment. It is sustainable, and I'll define that as well. And it is enduring. True, sustainable, and enduring. When I say true, we could get into a day-long debate about what is true, what is not, especially if anybody here has been to graduate school. You could go all day long. But for my own definitions, I am saying I'm considering something true if it is consistently constructive. Okay? And what I mean by that is, let me put it this way. I came into Alcoholics Anonymous with a belief that you look out for number one. Well, great. Except the problem was it wasn't, under this current definition, it wasn't true. Because when I lived it, it wasn't consistently constructive. It might have been constructive in a moment, but the longer I lived by it, it was actually destructive. And being of maximum service to God and those about me has been true for me for the last 34 and a half years. It's been consistently constructive. So it's true. Sustainable, what sustainable means is, it is like sustainable for me means that it, over time, it requires the same or less energy to keep going. Meaning, drinking for me was not sustainable. That doesn't mean I stopped early, but what it means is that over time it required more energy, it demanded more, it took more. It wasn't, I'm going to throw a $10 word out there, it wasn't generative. It did not generate more energy. So a sustainable principle does the opposite. It expands, it's expansive. Enduring, that means it has long-term consistency, which means being of maximum service to God and those about me. My experience is it is as true today as it was 34 and a half years ago. So when we talk about spiritual principles, we are talking about gen- general beliefs that are true, sustainable, and enduring. And since he's talking about spiritual principles, I would add, and this isn't, you don't have to write this down, but he's talking about spiritual principles. He's talking about principles rooted in our relationship with a higher power. So good so far? Everybody with me? Okay, I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's helpful for you moving forward. And I know we spent a little bit of time on that, but so now we're, and what he's saying, back to page 43, is he's been brought into a way of life, living infinitely more satisfying and I hope more useful than the life I lived before. Okay, and with this paragraph, we close out our time with Fred, although now we have a little bit of commentary in the next paragraph. The first two sentences I have here as just explanation or description, so they're in green. Fred's story speaks for itself. We hope it strikes home to thousands like him. He had felt only the first nip of the ringer, or as we would say today, Fred was a high bottom. The next sentence I have as a warning. Most alcoholics have to be pretty mangled before they really commence to solve their problems. And even though that fact, that sentence, has led to vast tragedy, maybe in our own lives and in the lives of people we know and many other alcoholics, I think it makes a lot of sense. And the reason that it makes a lot of sense is that because of two things. The delusion that basically tells us that we don't have a problem, and the fact that we are immersed in a society that more than ever preaches self-reliance and every man for himself. And what we have found, and what I'm continuing to find, I should say, is that in order for me to stay sober and usefully whole, I have to live a life that is in the world, but not of the world. And what I mean is, I live in the world, but I don't live by those principles. I live by very different principles. And in my own case, it was only through the intervention of a higher power that I was able to go from one mindset to the other. And that's why most alcoholics have to be pretty badly mangled before they really commence to solve their problem. And moving on, the next paragraph, the first two sentences I have in green for description explanation. Many doctors and psychiatrists agree with our conclusions. One of these men, staff member of a world-renowned hospital, recently made this statement to some of us. And if you have the study edition, you may see this. If you don't, which is fine, I incorrectly assumed that he was referring to Dr. Silkworth. I even wrote in the margin, Dr. Silkworth. And then I read the footnote. He's not talking about Dr. Silkworth. He's talking about Dr. Percy Pollock from Bellevue Hospital. So not that that point really matters, but I think what's more important is the idea that Dr. Pollock is conveying, and that I have highlighted in pink for a warning. Or I have most of it. I'll tell you as we go along. Okay, what you say about the general hopelessness of the average alcoholic's plight is, in my opinion, correct. As to two of you men whose stories I have heard. There is no doubt in my mind that you were 100% hopeless apart from divine help. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is 1939, and a physician, a man of science, is going on record and saying the only thing that was going to help you was divine intervention or divine help. I think that really drives home the notion that science and the power of our minds, they cannot save us from our alcoholism. Had you offered yourselves as patients at this hospital, I would not have taken you if I had been able to avoid it. People like you are too heartbreaking. And all of that quote up to this point, I've had highlighted in pink. And I just want to point something out. So for years, I assumed this was Dr. Silkworth. And I was confused by that last sentence where he says, if I could have avoided it, I wouldn't have taken you. Only because if you know Dr. Silkworth's story, he took everybody. He took Bill when Bill was hopeless. He took Bill when he knew there wasn't a solution. And I thought, when I read that and thinking it was Dr. Silkworth, I thought, well, that doesn't match his actions, but it's not Dr. Silkworth. So imagine that. The last two sentences in this paragraph I have in green. Though not a religious person, I have profound respect for the spiritual approach in such cases as yours. For most cases, there is virtually no other solution. So it's by turning to a doctor, a renowned doctor, Bellevue Hospital, even today, Bellevue Hospital, quite renowned, it is validating that a spiritual approach is absolutely necessary. And then in the last paragraph, Bill drives it home. I have all of this except for the last sentence in pink as a warning. And the last sentence I have in green as direction, as a critical direction. And so, once more, and what Bill is doing here, he's just summarizing, synthesizing the key point that he wants to convey in this entire chapter. Once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink, period. I think every word in that sentence is important, particularly at certain times. And what that means is, and this is the insidious nature of our alcoholism, because the ineffective solution works a lot of the time. The ineffective solution can work for decades. And think about it. And I don't want to get into anything controversial here, but just when I remember, when COVID was at its height and, we were all, or a lot of us were watching the news and everything. I remember watching a TV special on COVID, and it said one of the things that makes COVID so dangerous is that it has this incubation stage where you have it and you're spreading it, but you don't know it. You're symptom free. And so there's this sort of dark or blind period in which you're spreading the disease, but not suffering the symptoms. And then when the symptoms come on, it's hard to tell where and when you got it because you went through this blind period. alcoholism is very similar in that you can be engaging in the inappropriate or ineffective response. But imagine what would happen if the very second we engaged in self-will, we ended up drinking. Well, it would then think about how easy it would be to identify our problematic behaviors. Self-will drink, self-will drink. But that's not the way it works. How it works is self-will, 15 years of sobriety go by, and you end up drinking because you went to a child's birthday party and they were serving wine spritzers. So then what you come up against then is this thinking that, oh, the problem, I just have to avoid children's parties, or I just have to avoid wine spritzers and I'll be okay, when it has nothing to do with that.